In this session, we are exploring the question of addressing children's questions about faith, and I'm delighted that Emeritus Professor Trevor Cooling is able to be with us as we really have a conversation about that. And there are Trevor, when we spoke in preparing for this, we thought that it might be helpful to begin the kind of sort of little bit of the prehistory to this sort of question, which actually relates to a project that you were involved with a few years ago, which Olwyn Mark wrote, a document about passing on the faith, which also touched on a question of the kind of conversation that parents might have with children. So I wonder if it would be interesting to start with that sort of the background sort of to this area, and then we'll take it. We'll sort of move from there.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here and to be involved in this conversation. In no way do I feel like I've got much expertise in this area, other than having raised a family and been involved in church work, and I have a lot of big questions. But what I want to start by doing is just outlining how some of the questions have been clarified to me by the work that NICE has been involved in, both in the report that Bob has just posted and in reflecting on the Nexus report. So the report that Bob's just posted was published by a think tank called Theos, which is based in the Bible Society. And it was basically an attempt to get a picture of what the research is on the passing on of faith from parents to their children. And it was divided into two sections. The first section was a survey which was done through Comres of the attitudes of parents to the notion of transmission of faith. And the second part was the literature review. And I'm just going to give you a very brief insight into some of the key things that came out of that. When it was in relation to the survey, one of the things that was found was that there wasn't much enthusiasm in the general population, because it was a sort of comprehensive survey, for the notion that parents pass on their beliefs to their children. Only 31% actually said they wanted to do that, whereas 59% were dead against it. There was a difference if you looked at the different faith groups within the survey. So Christians who were active church attenders, 69% of them did actually want to pass it on. But what I want just to focus on there is a certain degree of animosity or anxiety in society about the notion of passing on faith. The second part of the report was the review of the literature, and Olwyn, who did this piece of work, looked up 54 big studies that are done around the world. And some of the key findings that she identified were things like this, that the foundations of faith are laid in childhood, that the family is central in faith transmission, that enduring adolescent and adult believers are largely the product of caring, supportive, stable homes, and that modelling is key, how parents model. So she emphasised the importance of high quality relationships in the home, the sort of style of parenting that's there. So she contrasted what she called an authoritative parenting. It seems to be one that is generally helpful, which means a disciplined environment, but not one where there's, if you like, pressure and excessive control about how children's faith develops. So she compared authoritative with authoritarian, which is what I've just described, and permissive. The latter two were not particularly helpful. And lastly, that she identified the role of both parents in faith transmission. Stability in the home is very important. And I'm pleased to say this, given my own status in life now, grandparents came out as very important. But I want to add a couple of things just to that report, which have emerged recently in research on children and young people's attitudes. The first is the British Social Attitudes Survey tells us that 70% of the 18 to 24 age group in this country would describe themselves as being of no religion. That's 70%. You have to then put that against the research, which shows this doesn't mean to say they're all atheists or they're not interested. What the other research is telling us is that there is a deep need for meaningful spiritual contact and conversation in life, that is one of the things that is yearned for in young people. So just to conclude what Olwyn's report showed up to us, she said this: the most effective, not so secret weapon in passing on beliefs and practices to the next generation remains parents. But parents have a sense of powerlessness in terms of the influencing of their children's faith. So that's the issue that we ended up with at the end of that report.
Thanks very much, Trevor. That's it still feels as relevant today as it was when it came out 4 years ago. Do you feel that we can add something to what we knew then from the new report, from the Nexus report? Do you have some sense of what we're able to bring to that understanding?
Yeah, how long have you got? I am so excited about this report because I think it's a huge achievement, and I think it opens up all sorts of possibilities which I've observed buzzing today. So perhaps if I could just pick out a few things that have really stood out to me. If I go back to parents, there's no doubt parents do find it very challenging. And those of us who have experienced parenting will know that also from our own personal experience. I think I saw 4 things that were being particularly identified by what the in-depth sort of study that has been done in this report. There's this pressure for knowing the answer. I've got to know the right answer. I've got to be able to answer all these questions. That's really challenging. There's a question about it being felt to be ethically wrong. Society doesn't approve of parents who seek to manipulate their children into faith. So there's this sort of guilt trip that goes with it. How do I start a conversation? You know, it's like when we're all exhorted to be evangelists on the London. You know, it feels like that. How do I start this really important conversation with my children? And I think one thing that parents worry about, which I get from this report, is that actually they're worried that what will happen is if they make their children too keen, that will make life difficult for them at school because they will stand out as being odd or something like that. So I think there's a sense that what the report has done is to clarify where some of these challenges lie, and so that we can begin to address them. I think the second thing that the Nexus report has really contributed is the sense that children can lead on this. I think parents can be a bit of an embarrassment really when they want to have the chat with children. You know, it used to be the birds and the bees chat, but now it's the spiritual life chat. And parents feel that somehow they've got to have this chat, and it becomes very awkward and difficult for everybody. What the report tells us is we need to relax a bit, that children can initiate this. I think the third thing the report does is tell us that the school, the church school, has a real place in actually supporting and helping children in being the initiators of that chat in the home. They do it partly by creating reflective spaces. I love the sort of things that children were saying about where they find peace, quietness, solitude. Those spaces are very important in order to be able to initiate chats. Spiritual gardens, those sorts of things. one of my colleagues here in Gloucester, Sharon Vickery, did a huge amount of work in promoting these notions of spiritual gardens. So the school has a very important place in creating that sort of, I suppose, culture. But the other thing it does, I think, is one that I was very encouraged by, was the sense that what it's doing in religious education, particularly through projects like the Understanding Christianity project, which if you don't know it, I think it's a really important one to get to know, because it's there in 4,000 church schools now. And what it does is give depth of theological conversation. It makes that available to children. And I think sometimes parents and churches may be shocked at the level of that conversation going on in school. And when they then go into Sunday school and find it's very trivial or very shallow, that can be difficult. So I think the resource of the school is something that came out to me. I've got some insights to follow from that if you want, but maybe now's the time to stop for a moment.
Well, I'm really struck by what you've been saying, Trevor, because I mean, I was thinking about and this is something that we tried to capture in the animation. I thought Ministry captured it very well, that the sorts of responses that that adults try to make are, you know, sort of can often be frustrated. So, you know, sort of sometimes clear and simple answers are not the are not so clear and simple to the person that's hearing, the child at the other side. It just doesn't sort of come through, or this this moral ambiguity, which is something that I think a lot about, because I mean, this moral ambiguity about choice and about the idea of choosing something, and the fear that parents have of being oppressive or unduly sort of directive, but also what we know about how quickly sort of patterns and languages, if you like, are learned by children, so that they become, you know, there's something that happens when children are very young that doesn't happen in the same way later on. So the sort of fear I have is that the choice is the idea of sort of saving up for a time when someone can make a free choice simply misunderstands what's happening in the formative phase of life, where, you know, children are actively putting pieces together. So I mean, that really spoke to me about what you said. I love what you said there about the spiritual chat and the pressure around the spiritual chat. You know, sort of people find religion more difficult, or spirituality more difficult than the birds and the bees. But I also was sort of thinking about the issue about silence. Someone was telling me about a student or a student activity on a retreat, the secondary school. There was a secondary school retreat actually, and there was some silence, or rather the students were being encouraged to have a time of silence, which meant they had to put their phones in a box. So the phones would have to be collected in. So it's sort of a camp kind of experience. And for one of the students, this was a trauma. The sort of putting the phone in the box was profoundly traumatic. And the student kind of went into a meltdown and sort of about this experience, and, you know, ended up sobbing, and then ended up having a very profound insight about how she missed her family. And I was really sort of, we used the phone motive in the animation, and I was really struck when I was spending some time in people who work in IT in Silicon Valley a couple of years ago, or a few years ago now, talking about the fact that none of them allowed their children to have their phones upstairs, actually even in their bedrooms, because the phones had to be charged to downstairs because of the, you know, the sort of the noise that it provides. So we've got these sort of quite strong insights that children might want silence, or might want reflection, and might want to initiate, but kind of things can get in the way and make that harder for them to do. And adults then find themselves not quite sure how to best support.
Yeah, actually, if I can pick up on a couple of the things you said there, Bob, about the sort of sense of not knowing what to say and not knowing how to answer questions, and also about the fear of the ethical, which are two things that struck me about the report. it seems to me that one of the issues that we have is that we're not clear about what it is we're passing on. So we're talking about passing on beliefs. That was certainly the focus of the Olwyn Mark's report, passing on beliefs. But actually, I think as Christians, we're not seeking actually primarily to pass on beliefs. Obviously, they're important, but we're seeking to pass on a relationship with God. So we're seeking to pass on a relationship. And it's that we need to focus on, and the sort of culture which that creates, because it changes the feel of what we do. It means that experiencing Christian faith in intimacy is important. You know, like when we tell bedtime stories at night, that's a point of intimacy. The chat about what we believe is sometimes a very unintimate situation. And that's a theological question, because I think theologically, we've come to be very much hung up on the belief side and not the relationship side. It needs to be rebalanced. And the other thing I think is the educational one, and that is that schools are increasingly, I'm finding, influenced by the idea that it's not their job. Even church schools. Now that may well change in the future, because I think the balance is changing with the new Ofsted inspection framework. But there are a lot of teachers who think it's nothing to do with their job, and therefore, and they see it as a sort of almost an unprofessional thing to do, to care about children's faith nurture. And I think there's some work to be done in challenging that.
I guess that's part of the uncertainty about what exactly it is that is a appropriate professional practice,
Exactly.
which kind of then gets bound up with the uncertainty about how to manage diversity, and then how to be able to say a thing. And of course, there's been quite a lot in the news recently about teachers being sort of new instructions and guidance for teachers on what political expressions they shouldn't express. You know, there's been quite a focus, hasn't there, in recent years on things you shouldn't talk about, or things you shouldn't perhaps be sharing in terms of your professional conduct and according to your views. So there's almost a sense that that side of life can get diminished. But I was really interested in what you were saying about relationship, because and the idea of developing a relationship with God, because it seems to me that also speaks directly to the mental well-being issue, the sort of sense of the interior place that a child has as they grow up, and how that is something that they feel a connection to, a relationship with another, and a relationship with God, or their spiritual sense of themselves. It's pretty clear from lots of other kinds of research that many of our young people are, not happy about that sort of that interior state that we would want them to have, and that I guess in a Christian sense we'd see as partly what that relationship with God would provide.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues for parents is the confusion of the relationship with God with believing what I think they ought to believe. And actually, the Christian faith develops over time. You only have to look back 30 or 40 years and you see it was expressed differently. People believe differently. It does develop. Our children may not believe in the same way that we do. We need, I think, to help parents relax about that, not to feel it's all about telling them the right answers and they must carry on believing those answers all the way along. It's much more about having a conversation about the relationship with God, which is, more relaxed. And it seems to me that one of the things that have struck me in the report, which I haven't yet mentioned, was about the impact of parachurch organisations or groups that work in schools, like Open the Book, prayer spaces in schools, Godly Play, Messy Church. They're all contexts where that sort of culture of relationship and conversation develops. And when children go home, a simple question like, what happened at school today can elicit conversation, because Open the Book's done something, or Prayer Spaces in School has created some question. Those are really rich opportunities. And I think the report helps identify that we need to find ways of releasing parents into those sorts of shared conversations.
It certainly seems to be the case, doesn't it, that there are people that certainly that the report identified who kind of act as sort of facilitating or animating people for this sort of relational conversation. And it's almost as if we can sort of, and I remember this was one of the conversations we had in the research team. We kept on feeling like there was a kind of a different shape of, it's almost like a different sort of shape of ministry that seemed to be enabling and facilitating of a different kind of encounter. And that in some way connects to the question that has come up, well, actually it came up yesterday at the Church of England research conference, about about what we think are the roles of ministers, and what we think ministry is, and what we think how that operates. It's almost as if we're seeing in those sorts of groups and activities that seem to strike chords with young people, that there is a different shape of facilitator or supporting or a sort of a witness or a sort of walking beside role that is perhaps not the traditional kind of authority figure that we've imagined in the past as being the kind of expounder of, or the passing on of the tradition in some way. One of the other features of this, which I thought quite a lot about, especially in recent weeks, where there have been, of course, those two really very, very serious reports about the churches and young people and their failings as institutions, is the sense in which that we've in a general sense, we've almost like lost faith in institutions, in traditional structures of institutions. They've come under enormous amounts of kind of criticism, whether it's the BBC, whether it's sort of schooling systems or the organizational structures of the church, or the media, let alone politics. There's a sense in which that kind of big corporate sort of thing that maybe in the past was a seat of authority in whatever form it took. We're now much more skeptical as a people towards those, and perhaps that also has and particularly young people seem to have suffered from that, whether it's the tech giants manipulating games to make money out of them through kind of gambling sort of opportunities, or preying on their interests, so that then you have this this kind of complexity that we can no longer be so confident about taking an institutional lead when it comes to sort of directing young people, because frankly there are questions, there are doubting questions there. There's people and perhaps that's part of the reason for having to trust in the spiritual dimension that young people have themselves, and actually allowing that to flourish in a different kind of way, because we simply can't pretend that the institutions have survived as things of authority that can be trusted in the way perhaps they were a generation or two ago.
Yeah, I think the report in one sense shows us a dimension of that, about when Anne was talking about belonging, an occasional belonging. And the institution probably doesn't value occasional belonging, doesn't help with the census and that sort of thing. But actually, a lot of people probably find the institution of the church quite threatening, disturbing, and somehow the church, within the church school context and the relationship between church, home and family, we somehow got to learn as an institution to be much more embracing and much less concerned about ourselves as an institution. And that seemed to me to be something that was coming out, and particularly that you've got parents who are talking about the faith about faith with their children when they themselves have, you know, don't see themselves as being identified at all with faith, and how we make that person feel they belong as part of the conversation is quite a challenge.
And there's a real tension there, isn't there? Because you you know, if you set a high bar for what membership is to be, you know, what counts as who the core are, you might have correctly identified a strong, pure set, but you might well have lost a community along the way, who are, you know, in a different place on their pilgrim journey, to use the word that sort of Carolyn Edwards has just used. Thanks for that, Carolyn. You know, who sort of lost them along the way, and seems to sort of well, it feels in striking contrast to some of the senses that we see certainly in the Gospels of, you know, people being somewhere along the way, seeming to be a concern that sort of certainly Jesus had in his life, and that the institutions were something that he had quite a few questions about then. So maybe there are some really important messages from that too. Now, I do want people to feel that if they want to pose a direct question, we'll have a go at answering it. And I know there's been a really healthy conversation going on, but we have got a few moments if people want to sort of, you know, come out and post a question, please do. I'll give you a chance to have a thought about that, and Trevor, do chip in if you've got another reflection to make whilst we're waiting. But
I was just looking at Jenny's comment about the sort of the school philosophy type group, where that sort of open discursive discussion is encouraged, and what Jenny calls basic apologetics, where people debate things, is encouraged in a sort of open and educative atmosphere, can lead to very interesting conversations. But the problem for parents is, how do they maintain that culture? Because they do feel this pressure to say, well, the right answer is, and so I do think we need to think, I don't know how we do it, but I think we need to think of how we resource parents to be able to deal with the sort of levels of conversation children are having in school.
Yeah, there are clearly, I mean, for parents, there are clearly these two different modes that we need to be wary of. And there are times, you know, there are times when you need to give an answer to a question that you're being asked because an answer is sought. And then there are the times when you need to, you know, be comfortable in the uncertainty, but understand how to walk with someone who is in that uncertainty, and judging when is the right time. And often it's the right time. It was always, what always struck me was it would be on the journey home that the question out of the blue from school, you know, walking back from school, that's when the question would come. It would be in these sort of soft periods of time where you suddenly find yourself inflicted with a fundamental foundational question that you know, you need to sort of be able to respond to.
Interesting. Jenny, Carolyn's put an interesting point up about clearly she's done some research which has shown that, I think if I got this right, that children are sort of concerned that their parents shouldn't be seeking to shape them. And I mean, I can sympathise with that. I mean, it's a long time ago now, but I remember as a child not really particularly wanting to be moulded by my parents. Actually, my act of rebellion was to become a Christian, which caused quite a deal of anxiety. But so I think allowing children to the space is really important. I think this notion of putting pressure on them and thinking that it's your job to make sure they believe what they should believe is really off-putting for children, I would imagine. Yeah. And you've got a couple of comments from Ed Paulson and John Moss about parents themselves being uncomfortable with their own faith journey leading to issues. I don't know what you think about that. I suppose the only thing you can do really is be honest with children in the end.
Yeah, I was reflecting on my own background there, because I have two contrasting. My parents were contrasting, because I had my mother, who had had converted when she was very young, had become a sort of an active and committed Christian as a teenager, and so when and so my upbringing was marked with quite explicit sharings. She would talk a lot about her spiritual experiences, including profound religious experiences she had had. But then my father, who was baptized when I was 16. So I was sort of in our household, we were aware of these differences. Although he did become a Christian. So there's a sort of there's a question, isn't there, about how comfortable we are in, and how comfortable we feel able to be open about our own sort of stage of journey, where we are in our own growth, in our own exploration, whether we have the language to express that, to to be happy to talk about the things that we hold fast to, but the things that we find unsure about or uncertain of, which almost points back to that interior dimension, that if we're unsettled ourselves in our own state, then how do we communicate that? And of course, there's been a bit of a change in public life about how acceptable it is to talk about adult uncertainties. I've heard interviews with sort of professional sports men and women talking about their own personal anxiety, and we've got the examples. We've got many public examples now of a different kind of opening up, and I wonder if there's an opportunity there to take some guidance from that.
Well, maybe the Nexus report has pointed out that maybe what we need to do is to ask our children for help. If what Anne is telling us is right, then it appears that there is spiritual maturity there with children who may actually help their parents in terms of their own journey. Because it's not as though that the parents are the ones who know and the kids are the ones who don't, which is the sort of model we sometimes work on. It can be the other way around, but I suppose that's quite risky.
Yeah. It's an interesting question there that Gareth Crispin has posed at the end there, about this sort of balance between top down and bottom up, and the discovery, and then the kind of proclamation dimension, and it seems to be that the conversation about those two things is really central to what we're talking about.
Right. Well, Gareth and I could have a very long conversation about his question. I'm going to push a bit on it, and more so than I actually believe, which is to say that I'm not sure that Scripture does place significant stress on heralding, proclaiming, preaching. I think it places significant stress on sharing, on living a life for Christ, on teaching. So I'm a sort of slightly challenging, well, more than slightly challenging the premise of the question there. Although obviously I do appreciate, I've got a wife doing a PhD on preaching, so I'm not anti-preaching. That would be very dangerous for my marriage. But I'm wanting to sort of change the emphasis about how we share the Christian faith as seen through Scripture. But it's a bit unfair on Gareth because he can't come back at me.
No, well, his microphone's turned off, although he's welcome to write. I mean, one of the questions in my mind is sort of the extent to which we're talking about people who are in the foothills, and who are in the beginnings, and we're probably we probably more than ever got a generation of adults who are themselves in the foothills of their journey, and maybe there's actually something quite positive about that, because perhaps there was a sense in which it was simply a received expectation and a requirement to kind of comply that might have been part of a format, a sort of an earlier time. whereas now perhaps maybe there's an argument that there's more of an honesty or an authenticity. I'm not sure what I think about that, but
well, can I share one more thought from the report which we haven't looked at yet, which is actually the significance of the nexus. Because in terms of helping children's or addressing children's questions about faith, I think the really fundamentally important thing that Anne has done in her report is to highlight that notion of the nexus, so that the partnership between church, school and home, with the child at the centre. Now, I'm a foster parent. A long time ago, my foster daughter was sort of young. She's now quite old. But one of the things that struck me about fostering is that in the early days, my experience of it, the different institutions involved didn't used to talk to each other. So the education people would do one thing and the social services would do something else. Health people would do something else. And they never talked about it. So the social services would keep moving children around and they never realized the impact that had on their education. Then things changed because the child became the focus and they had case conferences and everyone had to get together and talk about the child. I think we're in a situation still with this nexus that Anne has identified, where we're not really thinking about what's the child's experience of all three of these dimensions, how can we facilitate it. Church of England has an opportunity to do that because of its Board of Education structure, but I don't think we do that as much as we perhaps could in the local parish context. I think that's a really important thing that comes out of this report.
It's certainly really striking that many of the really positive narratives, that both those included in the report, but I also know those that that are in the data that hasn't necessarily all been out, are when you kind of get a doubling of power when there is a combining. So whether it's either the parents have come and spoken to the school, to teachers at the school, or possibly involving, or when a minister has come into the home environment, and you suddenly seem to get a kind of a sort of doubling or tripling of potential from that sort of combining. And I wonder if that is partly because it's sort of everybody is centering, as you say, on the child in those moments. And so it'd be really interesting to know if that kind of approach that, as you say, we've started to see the value of in other aspects of public services could be brought to bear on the spiritual concerns of the child. It certainly ought to be something that has some space in, well, whether we call the conversation well-being, but clearly that is something that we're thinking much more concretely about, is no longer off the cards in terms of a topic for discussion in schools. So